Maria and James had spent over a year planning their perfect wedding day. Every detail had been carefully chosen, from the delicate white roses that adorned the historic lakeside chapel to the handwritten vows they'd spent weeks perfecting. The morning of their wedding dawned bright and clear, seemingly blessed with perfect weather for their special day. Maria woke up early, surrounded by her closest friends in the bridal suite. Her stomach fluttered with nervous excitement as she sipped her morning coffee. "I can't believe it's finally happening," she whispered to her maid of honor, who squeezed her hand in response. Across town, James struggled with his tie, his fingers trembling slightly. His best man laughed and stepped in to help. "After 5 years together, you'd think you'd be cool as ice," he teased. James shook his head with a smile. 5 years, and I still get butterflies when I think about her." The ceremony was scheduled for 3 p.m. Guests began arriving at 2:30, filling the small chapel with excited chatter and the rustle of formal clothes. The historic building, with its stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the wooden floors, had been a dream venue for the couple since they'd first visited it on a tour of wedding locations. "It just feels right," Maria had said back then, gazing up at the vaulted ceiling. James had agreed immediately. They'd both wanted something intimate, meaningful, and connected to the community they'd built their life in. By 2:55, the chapel held 60 of their closest friends and family. Maria's grandfather sat in the front row, proudly displaying the handkerchief Maria had embroidered with the wedding date as a gift to all the guests. James's young nieces whispered excitedly as they prepared for their role as flower girls, their small baskets filled with rose petals. At exactly 3 p.m., the string quartet began playing the piece that Maria and James had selected together. Not the traditional wedding march, but a gentle melody that had been playing the night they met at a friend's dinner party. James took his place at the altar, his best man beside him, and watched with wonder as the chapel doors opened. Maria appeared in her dress, a simple but elegant gown that seemed to catch the light as she moved. There was an audible intake of breath from the assembled guests. James later told friends that in that moment everything else disappeared. The chapel, the guests, even the nervous anticipation. All he could see was Maria, and all he could feel was overwhelming love. Her father walked her down the aisle, his eyes glistening with tears he tried to blink away. He had practiced this walk for weeks, determined not to stumble on his daughter's big day. When they reached the altar, he kissed Maria's cheek and placed her hand in James's, a gesture so simple, yet loaded with meaning. The ceremony itself was everything they'd hoped for. The officiant, a family friend who had known James since childhood, spoke about commitment, partnership, and the journey they were beginning together. Maria's college roommate read a poem that had the guests reaching for tissues. James's brother played a short piece on the guitar, a talent few knew he possessed until that day. When it came time for the vows, Maria's voice shook slightly as she promised to stand by James through whatever life brought them. "You've been my rock, my best friend, and my favorite person to laugh with," she said, her words carrying clearly through the hushed chapel. "I promise to be yours, completely and without reservation, for all our days." James, usually so composed, had to pause twice during his vows to collect himself. "You make me better," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day with you feels like a gift I never expected to receive." As they exchanged rings, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds and streamed through the stained glass, bathing them in rainbow colors. Later, guests would recall this moment as almost magical, as if nature itself was blessing their union. "I'll pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant declared at 3:19 p.m., and the chapel erupted in cheers and applause as James and Maria shared their first kiss as a married couple. They turned to face their guests beaming with joy, completely unaware that their lives together would be measured not in years or decades, but in minutes. The recessional music played as they walked back down the aisle, guests reaching out to touch their hands or shoulders in congratulation. Outside the chapel, they paused for photos on the ancient stone steps, surrounded by their wedding party. The photographer captured them looking at each other, their expressions so full of love and hope that these images would later become unbearably poignant. According to the carefully planned schedule, they should have headed directly to the reception venue, a renovated boathouse by the lake where dinner and dancing awaited. The vintage limousine they'd hired sat ready at the curb, decorated with flowers and ribbons. But as they stood outside the chapel, surrounded by well-wishes and confetti, James leaned close to Maria's ear. "What if we take a quick detour?" he suggested, his eyes sparkling with spontaneity. "Just 15 minutes, just for us." Maria's smile widened. "What did you have in mind?" James nodded toward his best man's car, a lovingly restored convertible that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Remember our first date? The drive along the coast?" Of course she remembered. They had spent hours driving along the shoreline road, talking endlessly, discovering each other. It was where James had first reached for her hand, where their story truly began. "The guests won't mind waiting a few extra minutes," James said, already knowing her answer from the look in her eyes. Maria squeezed his hand. "Let's do it." They quickly explained their plan to the wedding coordinator, who agreed to let the reception guests know they'd be arriving slightly later than planned. James's best man tossed him the keys with a knowing smile. "Don't be too long, lovebirds." They slipped away from the crowd, Maria gathering her dress carefully as she slid into the passenger seat of the convertible. James removed his formal jacket and loosened his tie in the warm afternoon air. As they pulled away from the chapel, Maria unpinned her veil, letting it flutter beside her in the gentle breeze. "Mrs. Sullivan," James said, testing the sound of her new name as they drove through town toward the coastal road. Maria leaned over to kiss his cheek, leaving a faint lipstick mark that she wiped away with her thumb. "That's me," she laughed. "For now and always." The coastal road welcomed them with familiar curves and breathtaking views. The ocean stretched out beside them, glittering in the sunlight. They drove with the top down, the wind playing with Maria's carefully styled hair, neither of them caring about anything except this perfect moment together. "I was so nervous this morning," James confessed as they followed the winding road. "Not about marrying you, never that, but about everything going perfectly." Maria nodded, understanding completely. "And now none of that matters, does it? The day could have gone completely off the rails, and I'd still be the happiest person alive right now." They pulled over at a scenic overlook, the same spot where they'd stopped on their first date. Below them, waves crashed against the rocky shore, and seagulls soared on the ocean breeze. James helped Maria out of the car, both of them laughing as her dress caught on the seat. Standing at the railing, looking out at the vast expanse of water, they took a moment to absorb the reality of what had just happened. They were married. They had promised themselves to each other for life. "I've never felt so certain about anything," Maria said softly, leaning her head against James's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Me neither. It's like everything before was leading us here." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the waves, listening to the cry of the gulls. Neither noticed how the wind had begun to pick up slightly, or how the clouds on the distant horizon had started to darken. In their bubble of newlywed bliss, the changing weather went completely unobserved. "We should probably head back," James said eventually, checking his watch. "Our guests will be wondering where we've disappeared to." Maria nodded reluctantly. "Just one more minute," she said, taking out her phone. "Let me get a picture of us here. Our first photo as husband and wife in our special place." They took several selfies, laughing as they tried to get the angle right with the ocean behind them. In the last picture, the one that would later become famous, they were both smiling widely at the camera, the wind beginning to toss Maria's hair across her face, their happiness so evident it seemed to radiate from the image. As they got back into the car, still caught up in the magic of the moment, neither of them had any idea that they had just taken the last photographs of their lives or that the weather system developing offshore was about to change everything. They were simply two people deeply in love, celebrating the beginning of what they thought would be a long and beautiful journey together. As James turned the key in the ignition, the convertible rumbled to life beneath them. Maria adjusted her dress, tucking the layers of fabric carefully so they wouldn't catch in the door. The satin material, which had seemed so perfect in the bridal shop, now felt a bit impractical for an impromptu coastal drive. Still, she wouldn't have changed a thing about this moment. "Ready for our mini honeymoon?" James asked with a playful wink, putting the car into gear. "All 15 minutes of it?" Maria laughed, reaching over to place her hand on his knee as they pulled away from the scenic overlook. The coastal road stretched before them like a ribbon laid against the shoreline. On their right, the land sloped upward into green hills dotted with wildflowers. On their left, the ocean extended to the horizon, a vast expanse of blue that seemed to hold infinite possibilities, much like their future together. The convertible hugged the curves of the road, and Maria tilted her head back to feel the wind on her face. "I can't believe we actually did it," she said after a comfortable silence. "Do you remember how nervous you were when you proposed?" James groaned at the memory. "How could I forget? I dropped the ring in the sand and we spent 20 minutes searching for it in the dark. With our phone flashlights," Maria added, giggling at the recollection. "And that couple walking their dog thought we were crazy. Worth it, though," James said, taking his eyes off the road for just a second to glance at her. "The look on your face when I finally asked you, I'll remember that forever." Maria squeezed his knee affectionately. These were the moments she treasured most. The easy conversation, the shared memories, the way they could laugh about the mishaps that had shaped their relationship. 5 years together, and they still found new things to talk about, new reasons to fall in love with each other. As they rounded a bend in the road, they saw an elderly couple walking hand in hand along the coastal path. James honked lightly and waved, and the couple waved back with warm smiles. "That'll be us someday," he said confidently, still holding hands at 80. 80? "I'm thinking more like 100, Maria replied. "We've got a lot of living to do together." The sun was still bright overhead, but James noticed a slight change in the quality of the light. A few clouds had drifted across the sky, casting brief shadows on the road ahead. He checked his watch. They'd been gone for about 10 minutes. "We should probably start heading back soon," he said reluctantly, "though I wish we could just keep driving." "We'll have the honeymoon for that," Maria reminded him. 2 whole weeks on the coast, no schedules, no work, no interruptions, just us. They'd booked a small cottage further up the shoreline, a place known for its privacy and spectacular sunsets. The reservation started tomorrow. Tonight they would stay at the honeymoon suite in the hotel where their reception was being held. Everything had been meticulously planned down to the last detail. "Speaking of which," James said, "do you think your Uncle Rick will actually manage to keep his toast under 5 minutes? Your dad bet me $20 he'll go on for at least 15. Maria rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "No chance. Once he starts telling the story about how he always knew we were meant for each other, from the first time he saw us together, he'll never stop. Dad's going to win that bet for sure." The thought of returning to their guests brought a mix of emotions. They were excited to celebrate with everyone who had come to share in their happiness, but there was something magical about these stolen moments alone. Just the two of them, newly married, with no one else around. "Maybe we should take the long way back," James suggested, slowing the car slightly. "There's that little cove a few miles ahead. We could stop there for just a minute or two." Maria glanced at her phone to check the time. "The reception doesn't officially start for another 40 minutes, she calculated, and everyone will be too busy with the cocktail hour to notice if we're a little late." Her smile turned mischievous. "Let's do it." James grinned and pressed the accelerator, the engine responding with a satisfying purr. The wind caught Maria's hair, pulling a few more strands loose from her elegant updo. She didn't mind. There would be plenty of time for touching up before they made their grand entrance at the reception. They were so engrossed in each other and the joy of the moment that neither of them paid much attention to the darkening clouds gathering on the horizon. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for a spring wedding. No one had mentioned the possibility of a storm. About 2 miles down the road, they approached a section where the highway curved sharply, following the natural contour of a small bay. This stretch was known locally as Lover's Curve because of the romantic view it offered. It was also notorious for being dangerously narrow, with the guardrail separating the road from a steep drop to the rocks and water below. As they neared the curve, James instinctively slowed the convertible. "Remember when we came here on your birthday last year?" he asked. "And you insisted we pull over so you could take photos at sunset?" The light was perfect, Maria defended herself with a smile. "Those pictures are still my favorites." "Mine, too," James agreed. "In fact, I have one as my phone background at work. The guys give me a hard time about being such a romantic, but I don't care." Maria was about to respond when she noticed something strange. The wind, which had been pleasantly cool against her skin, suddenly picked up strength. It whipped her dress around her legs and sent a loose program from the wedding ceremony flying out of the back seat. "Whoa," James said, gripping the steering wheel more firmly as a gust pushed against the side of the car. "That came out of nowhere." Maria looked out toward the ocean and felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. The sky over the water had changed dramatically in just the past few minutes. Dark, heavy clouds now dominated the horizon, moving toward the shore with surprising speed. The surface of the water, which had been relatively calm earlier, was now chopped into white-capped waves that crashed against the rocks below with increasing force. "James, I think we should turn around," she said, her voice tight with sudden concern. "That doesn't look good." He nodded, already scanning the road ahead for a place to turn. "You're right. I've never seen the weather change this fast." The narrow road offered few opportunities for a safe U-turn. James drove a bit further, looking for a wider section or a pullout. The wind continued to intensify, bringing with it the first few drops of rain that pelted the windshield like tiny bullets. There, Maria pointed to a small scenic turnout just ahead. "You can turn there." James nodded and put on his signal, though there were no other cars around to see it, a habit from years of careful driving. As they approached the turnout, however, a powerful gust of wind hit the convertible broadside, forcing James to correct their course. The car swerved slightly, its tires skimming dangerously close to the edge of the road. "Careful!" Maria gasped, instinctively grabbing the dashboard. "It's okay," James assured her, though his knuckles had turned white on the steering wheel. "We're fine. Almost there." They reached the turnout, and James carefully maneuvered the car around. The rain was falling more steadily now, and he reached for the controls to put up the convertible's top. The mechanical whir seemed unnaturally loud as the roof began to close over their heads. "I guess our little detour is getting cut short," Maria said, trying to keep her tone light despite the growing knot of anxiety in her chest. Something about the rapidly darkening sky and the increasing violence of the waves below made her deeply uneasy. "Better safe than sorry," James replied, securing the roof latches. "We'll be back at the reception venue in no time. They've probably hardly noticed we're gone." They started back the way they had come, but the conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The rain fell harder, drumming against the roof and streaming down the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. Visibility decreased with each passing minute, and the wind buffeted the car with growing intensity. "I've never seen a storm come in this fast," James said, leaning forward to peer through the rain-streaked windshield. The forecast said clear skies all day. Maria pulled out her phone to check for weather alerts. "No signal," she muttered, showing him the screen. "That's weird. We usually have coverage out here." The coastal road, which had seemed so invitingly scenic just minutes ago, now felt treacherous. Water was beginning to pool in the lower sections, and small rivulets of runoff streamed across the pavement from the hillside. James drove cautiously, both hands firmly on the wheel, his entire body tense with concentration. They were approaching Lover's Curve again when a flash of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The proximity of the strike indicated that the storm was directly overhead now. "That was close," Maria whispered, counting the seconds as she'd been taught as a child. 1,000, 2 1,000. The next flash came before she reached 3, and the accompanying thunder shook the car. As they entered the curve, James slowed to a crawl. Through the curtain of rain, they could see waves crashing over the guardrail ahead, water spilling onto the road surface. The ocean, driven by the wind and what must have been an unusually high tide, was beginning to reclaim parts of the highway. "I don't think we can get through that," James said, his voice tight with concern. "We should try to find another route." But as they sat there deliberating their next move, the decision was made for them. A massive wave, larger than any they had seen so far, surged over the barrier and washed across the road ahead. It brought with it a shower of small rocks and debris that clattered against the car's hood and windshield. "We need to turn back," Maria said urgently. Now, James didn't need to be told twice. He began to back up carefully, looking for a safe place to turn around once again. The wind howled around them, and the rain fell in sheets so dense that the wipers struggled to maintain even minimal visibility. They had retreated perhaps 50 yards when Maria suddenly pointed ahead. "James, look." Through the rain, they could see headlights approaching from the other direction, another vehicle attempting to navigate the treacherous conditions. As it drew nearer, they could make out the shape of a large pickup truck moving, slowly but steadily toward them. "Maybe they know a safe way through," James said hopefully, flashing his lights to get the driver's attention. The truck pulled alongside them and stopped. The driver, an older man in a rain-slicked jacket, rolled down his window just enough to call out to them. "Road's flooding up ahead," he shouted over the howling wind. "They're closing it down about a mile back that way. Flash flood warning just went out. Is there another way back to town?" James called back. The man shook his head grimly. "Inland route through the hills. Follow me. I know the way." In that moment, faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation and few options, James and Maria made the fateful decision that would change everything. They nodded their agreement to the stranger, ready to follow his guidance to safety, completely unaware that they had just passed the 30-minute marks in saying "I do." The stranger's truck pulled ahead of them, its taillights glowing like red eyes through the curtain of rain. James followed carefully, keeping a safe distance between the vehicles as they crept along the increasingly treacherous road. The convertible, though beautiful for a sunny coastal drive, was not designed for these conditions. Its low profile made James nervous as he navigated through puddles that seemed to grow deeper by the minute. "Do you think we should call someone?" Maria asked, trying her phone again. "Let them know we're delayed?" The screen still showed no service bars, a small emergency calls only message mocking their situation. "As soon as we get signal," James promised, squinting through the windshield. The wipers worked frantically but struggled to keep up with the downpour. "Your mom is probably already wondering where we are." Maria glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:52 p.m. They should have been greeting guests at the reception by now, accepting congratulations and sharing their first champagne toast as husband and wife. Instead, they were following a stranger's truck through what was rapidly becoming the worst storm either of them had ever experienced. The pickup ahead slowed suddenly, and James tapped the brakes. Through the rain, they could see why. A large branch had fallen across part of the road. The truck driver got out, his figure barely visible as he dragged the branch aside, then waved them forward before climbing back into his vehicle. "That was nice of him," Maria said, feeling a flash of gratitude toward this unknown Good Samaritan who was helping them navigate back to safety. They continued on, turning away from the coastal road onto a narrower route that wound uphill through dense trees. This road, while less prone to flooding from the ocean, presented its own challenges. Runoff from the hillside streamed across the pavement carrying small rocks and debris. The trees offered some shelter from the direct force of the rain, but created a new hazard as branches swayed violently in the wind. A particularly strong gust shook the car, and Maria reached instinctively for James's hand on the gear shift. "This is getting scary," she admitted, her earlier bravado fading. "We'll be okay," James reassured her, though his own knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. "This route takes us higher up. We'll be above any flooding." The truck ahead maintained a steady pace, its four-wheel drive handling the conditions far better than their convertible. James had to concentrate fully just to keep up, navigating around debris and through water that splashed up over the hood. Lightning. flashed again, illuminating the landscape in a brief harsh light that cast eerie shadows through the trees. The thunder that followed was immediate and deafening, suggesting the strike had been very close. "That hit something," Maria gasped, looking out the side window. In the next flash of lightning, they could see that a tree about 50 yards off. The road was now split and smoking despite the rain. James swallowed hard. "We need to find shelter soon, this isn't safe." As if in response to his words, the truck ahead slowed again and put on its hazard lights. James pulled up behind it and they watched as the driver got out and jogged back toward them, hunched against the driving rain. James rolled his window down just enough for communication. The rain immediately spattered inside, but he hardly noticed. "Roads washed out about a quarter-mile ahead," the man shouted over the howling wind. His face was lined with concern, rain streaming from his battered cap. "Too much runoff coming down the hillside. I know another way, but it's a dirt road. Not sure your car can make it." James and Maria exchanged worried glances. A dirt road in this weather would likely be a muddy, impassable mess for their low-clearance convertible. "Is there anywhere nearby we can wait out the storm?" James asked. The man considered for a moment, then nodded. "There's an old ranger station about 2 miles back. Might be our best bet." He looked up at the roiling sky, his expression grim. "This ain't letting up anytime soon." "We'll follow you," James decided, already putting the car in reverse. They backtracked slowly, even more cautious now that they were retracing their path. The road seemed to have deteriorated further in just the short time since they'd passed through. New rivulets of water crossed the pavement, and a small landslide had deposited a pile of mud and rocks along one curve. "I hope everyone at the reception is okay," Maria said softly, watching as the truck ahead navigated around the obstacle. "The venue is right on the lake. If this storm is hitting there too..." "They're in a solid building," James reminded her. "And Tom will make sure everyone's safe." Tom, their wedding coordinator, was known for his attention to detail and quick thinking. He's probably already moved everything indoors and turned it into a cozy rainy day reception. Maria tried to smile at the image, but another flash of lightning and immediate thunder made her flinch instead. "This is getting worse, not better." She wasn't wrong. The wind had intensified to the point where it rocked their car even when they were moving. Small branches and leaves littered the road, and twice now they'd had to navigate around fallen limbs too large to drive over. They followed the truck around a sharp bend in the road, and suddenly the man's brake lights flared red through the rain. James slowed quickly, peering ahead to see what had caused the sudden stop. "Oh no," Maria whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. A massive tree had fallen directly across the road, its enormous trunk blocking their path completely. Even as they watched, another branch crashed down from above, landing with a sickening thud on the road just yards ahead of them. The truck driver was out again, waving his arms frantically for them to back up. James didn't hesitate, immediately throwing the car into reverse and retreating from the danger of more falling branches. They backed up about 50 yards before stopping, and the truck driver jogged up to their window again, now thoroughly soaked despite his rain gear. "We're trapped," he panted, wiping rain from his face. "Tree behind us, too, just came down. Radio says the whole area's getting hammered. Multiple roads closed, landslides, flooding." Maria felt her chest tighten with real fear now. "So what do we do?" The man looked around, assessing their options. "There's an old fire trail about 100 yards back. Barely more than a path, but it might get us to higher ground. Your car won't make it, though." He hesitated, then added, "We might have to go on foot." The thought of abandoning the safety of their vehicle, tenuous as it was, sent a chill through Maria that had nothing to do with her now damp wedding dress. "Is that safe?" "Safer than staying here with trees coming down all around us," the man replied grimly. James nodded slowly. "He's right, honey. We need to get to safer ground." Decision made, they prepared to leave the car. James reached into the back seat for his suit jacket, which he insisted Maria put on over her dress for what little additional protection it might offer. The man, who finally introduced himself as Ray, a local who knew these hills like the back of his hand, offered Maria his rain jacket, but she refused. "You need it more than I do," she insisted. "I've already got James's jacket." Ray nodded respectfully, then pointed toward a barely visible opening in the underbrush beside the road. "That's the trail. Stay close. Watch your step. Ground's gonna be slippery." They locked the convertible, though it seemed a pointless precaution, under the circumstances, and followed Ray toward the trailhead. The moment they stepped out from the shelter of the car, the full force of the storm hit them. The wind nearly knocked Maria off her feet, and the rain fell so heavily it was difficult to breathe without feeling like she was drowning. James wrapped a protective arm around her waist, helping her stay upright as they made their way to the trail. Her wedding shoes, elegant satin heels chosen to match her dress, were immediately ruined by the mud and offered almost no traction on the slick ground. "Wait," she gasped, stopping to kick them off. The cold mud squished between her toes, but at least now she could walk without falling with every step. James picked up the discarded shoes without comment and stuffed them into his pocket. The trail was little more than a deer path that wound its way up the densely forested hillside. Under normal circumstances, it might have been a pleasant hiking route, offering glimpses of the ocean through the trees. Now it was a treacherous obstacle course of slippery roots, mud-filled depressions, and the constant danger of falling branches. Ray led the way, occasionally turning to make sure they were still behind him. James kept a firm grip on Maria's hand, helping her over the worst spots and steadying her when she slipped. Her dress, once pristine white, was now muddy and sodden, the hem dragging heavily around her ankles. She had given up trying to hold it up after the first few minutes. "You okay?" James asked as they paused briefly under a particularly dense section of canopy that offered slightly more protection from the rain. Maria nodded, though in truth she was far from okay. She was cold, wet, frightened, and increasingly aware of the danger they were in. But complaining wouldn't help their situation. "Just not how I pictured spending our wedding day," she managed with a weak smile. James pulled her close for a moment, both of them shivering now. "When we tell our grandkids about this someday, it'll make one hell of a story." The thought was comforting, the idea that this was just a dramatic chapter in what would be a long life together, a story they'd eventually laugh about. Maria clung to it as they continued their difficult climb. Ray stopped ahead of them, waiting until they caught up. "Ranger station should be just over this ridge," he shouted over the wind. "Maybe half a mile more." The news gave them a much-needed boost of energy. Half a mile to shelter, to safety. They could make it, but the storm had other plans. As they crested the ridge, the trees thinned out, exposing them more directly to the elements. The wind hit them with renewed fury, driving the rain horizontally into their faces. Maria gasped at the intensity, turning her face away from the onslaught, and that's when they heard it, a deep, ominous rumbling that seemed to come from the ground itself. At first, Maria thought it was just thunder, but the sound didn't fade. Instead, it grew louder, accompanied by a terrible cracking noise. "Landslide!" Ray yelled, his voice barely audible over the storm and the growing rumble. "Run! Get to the trees!" They ran, slipping and stumbling on the muddy trail. James kept a death grip on Maria's hand, practically dragging her along as her dress hampered her movements. The rumbling grew louder, and they could feel the ground vibrating beneath their feet. Maria risked a glance back and immediately wished she hadn't. A section of the hillside above them had broken free and was sliding downward, a churning mass of mud, rocks, and uprooted vegetation. It was moving with terrifying speed, following the natural contour of the land, directly toward the trail they were on. "James!" she screamed, her voice lost in the cacophony of the storm and the approaching landslide. He had seen it too. With a surge of desperate strength, he pulled her forward toward a cluster of larger trees that stood like sentinels just ahead. Ray was already there, waving frantically for them to hurry. The roar of the landslide was deafening now. Maria could feel it behind them, gaining ground with every second. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, and her bare feet were cut and bruised from the rough trail. but fear gave her the strength to keep moving. They were almost to the trees when Maria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The edge of the trail was giving way, crumbling into the path of the landslide. She stumbled, her hand slipping from James's grasp as she fell to her knees. "Maria!" James turned back for her immediately, reaching out to grab her arm. Behind them, the landslide surged closer, swallowing everything in its path. Ray shouted something from the trees, but his words were lost in the roar. All Maria could see was James's face, determined and afraid as he pulled her to her feet. All she could feel was his hand, strong and sure around her wrist, as they made one final desperate dash for safety. And then, in a moment that would be etched into the memories of everyone who later heard their story, the ground between them and safety simply disappeared, swept away by the leading edge of the landslide. They stood on a crumbling island in a sea of flowing mud and debris, with no way forward and destruction closing in from behind. As Maria looked into James's eyes in that terrible moment, a strange calm settled over her. Somehow, in the midst of the storm and chaos, she found peace in the simple fact that whatever happened next, they were together, in sickness and in health, for better or worse. They had made those promises less than an hour ago, never imagining how soon they would be tested. The last thing she remembered was James pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her in a protective embrace as the world dissolved around them, and above the roar of the landslide and the howling of the wind, she thought she heard him whisper, "I love you." It was 3:49 p.m., exactly 30 minutes after they had been pronounced husband and wife. Ray watched in horror as the ground beneath the Newlyweds gave way. One moment they were there, making a desperate run for safety, and the next they were gone, swept away in a churning mass of mud, rocks, and broken trees. He stood frozen, his mind unable to process what his eyes had just witnessed. The young couple, the bride still in her wedding dress, the groom still in his suit pants and white shirt, had vanished in seconds. "No!" he shouted, the word torn from his throat and immediately swallowed by the howling wind. "No, no, no!" The landslide continued its destructive path down the hillside, taking everything in its wake. Ray backed further into the trees, knowing there was nothing he could do but save himself now. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, praying for a signal. A single bar flickered on his screen, weak, but possibly enough. He dialed emergency services with trembling fingers. When the call connected, the dispatcher's voice was broken and staticky, but audible. 911, what's your emergency? Landslide, Ray managed, his voice cracking. 2 people swept away, a couple newlyweds. We were trying to reach the old ranger station. Sir, can you give me your location? Ray described their position as best he could, explaining about the fallen trees that had blocked the road, forcing them to take the trail. The groom said his name was James, he added, the reality of what had happened beginning to sink in. His wife, her name was Maria. They just got married today. They were still in their wedding clothes. The dispatcher promised to send search and rescue teams immediately, but warned that the storm was hampering emergency responses throughout the region. Multiple incidents are being reported. It may take time to reach you. These people don't have time, Ray said grimly, staring at the path of destruction below him. The thought of that young couple, so full of life and love just minutes earlier, now buried beneath tons of mud and debris, made his stomach churn. Just hurry, please. The call ended and Ray was left alone with the storm and his thoughts. Despite the danger of remaining where he was, he couldn't bring himself to continue to the ranger station. Not yet. Not without at least trying to see if by some miracle the couple had survived. Carefully, he made his way to the edge of the stable ground, peering down at the devastation below. The landslide had carved a wide path down the hillside, leaving nothing but mud and broken vegetation in its wake. There was no sign of the newlyweds. "James! Maria!" he shouted, knowing it was futile but unable to stop himself. The only response was the continued howl of the wind and the steady drumming of rain on the leaves above. At the reception venue, the mood had shifted from celebratory to concerned. The storm had forced the festivities indoors, but that was a minor inconvenience compared to the growing worry about the bride and groom's absence. They were now 40 minutes late, and all attempts to reach them by phone had failed. Maria's mother, Linda, paced near the entrance, her forehead creased with worry lines. "Something's wrong," she kept saying to anyone who would listen. "They should have been here by now." Tom, the wedding coordinator, tried to maintain a calm demeanor as he reassured the guests and family members. "I'm sure they're just waiting. Out the worst of the storm somewhere," he said, though his own concern was mounting. He had worked with enough couples to know that newlyweds didn't just disappear on their wedding day without communication, not unless something had prevented them from making contact. The best man, whose convertible the couple had borrowed, was particularly upset. "I shouldn't have given them the keys," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "That car isn't made for weather like this." James's father, a retired police officer, had already contacted the local authorities to report the missing couple. They said there are multiple emergencies happening because of the storm. He reported back to the anxious family members who had gathered in a quiet corner of the reception hall. "But they've put out an alert for the car." Linda clutched her husband's arm. "What if they tried to take that coastal road? You know how James loves driving along there." The thought sent a chill through the group. The coastal highway was scenic on a clear day but could be treacherous during storms. And this was no ordinary storm. The local news, which was now playing on a television in the venue's bar area, was reporting widespread damage throughout the region. "Flash flood warnings remain in effect for the entire coastal area," the reporter announced gravely. "Multiple roads are closed due to flooding and landslides, and emergency services are stretched thin responding to calls. Residents are urged to stay indoors and avoid all travel unless absolutely necessary." The camera cut to footage of waves crashing over a familiar guardrail, water sweeping across a road that the family instantly recognized as part of the coastal route. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's it. That's where they would have gone." James's father immediately pulled out his phone again, this time to provide the authorities with this critical information. "My son and his wife might be on the coastal highway," he told the dispatcher urgently. "They left their wedding ceremony about 45 minutes ago in a red convertible." The dispatcher's response was not encouraging. "Sir, we've had reports of multiple incidents along that route, including a section where the road has been completely washed away. Search and rescue teams are being dispatched, but again, response times are delayed due to the severity of the storm." As he relayed this information to the others, a heavy silence fell over the group. What had begun as a perfect wedding day had somehow transformed into a nightmare of uncertainty and fear. Meanwhile, nearly 3 miles away from where they had been swept away, something miraculous was happening. In a bend of the creek that normally trickled peacefully down to the ocean but was now a raging torrent, a tangle of broken trees and debris had created a natural dam, and caught in this makeshift barrier, barely visible among the twisted branches and mud, was a splash of white fabric. Maria regained consciousness slowly, her mind foggy and her body aching in ways she couldn't immediately identify. The first sensation she registered was cold, bone-deep, shivering cold that seemed to have replaced the blood in her veins. The second was the sound of rushing water, loud and close. And the third, most terrifying realization, was that she couldn't move her legs. Panic surged through her as her eyes flew open. She was partially submerged in muddy water, her lower body pinned beneath what looked like part of a tree trunk. Above her, the sky was still dark with storm clouds, though the rain had lessened somewhat to a steady drizzle. Around her was a chaotic jumble of debris, branches, rocks, mud, and things she couldn't identify. "James?" she called, her voice a hoarse whisper that was immediately swallowed by the sound of the water. She tried again, louder this time, ignoring the pain in her chest. "James." For a terrifying moment, there was no response, and Maria felt a wave of despair wash over her. Then from somewhere nearby, she heard a groan. Hope surged through her, giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. "James, I'm here. Where are you?" Another groan, followed by a weak voice. "Maria, are you okay?" She nearly sobbed with relief at the sound. "I'm stuck. My legs are pinned. I can't see you. Keep talking so I can figure out where you are." "I'm caught in some branches," James replied, his voice stronger now. I think I'm only a few feet away from you. To your right. Maria turned her head in that direction, straining to see through the tangle of debris. At first she saw nothing but broken tree limbs and swirling water. Then a movement caught her eye. A hand, rising above the chaos, waving weakly. I see you, she called. Can you get free? There was a pause, filled with the sounds of movement and effort. I think so, James finally answered. Nothing feels broken, just bruised. A lot bruised. There was more movement, accompanied by grunts of pain and the cracking of branches. Then, like a swimmer emerging from underwater, James's head and shoulders appeared above the debris. His face was scratched and bloody, his once white shirt now a mix of brown mud and crimson stains. But his eyes, those eyes that had looked at her with such love as they exchanged their vows, were alert and focused entirely on finding her. Maria, he gasped when he spotted her. With renewed energy, he pushed and pulled his way through the tangle of branches and flood debris, ignoring the new cuts and bruises this caused. It seemed to take forever, but was probably less than a minute before he reached her side. Oh my God, he breathed, taking in her situation. The tree trunk across her legs was massive, far too heavy for him to move alone. Are you hurt? Can you feel your legs? Maria nodded, then shook her head. Yes to both. I can feel them and they hurt, but I can't move. I think I might have a broken rib too. She winced as she tried to take a deep breath. What happened? Where are we? James looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The landslide must have carried us down to the creek. We're caught in some kind of debris dam. He glanced up at the hillside above them, where a wide path of destruction showed the landslide's route. We're lucky to be alive. Ray? Maria asked, suddenly remembering the man who had been helping them. James shook his head. I don't know. I didn't see him after we fell. He turned his attention back to the tree pinning Maria. We need to get you out of here. This whole pile of debris could break loose any minute. As if to emphasize his point, there was a shifting sensation beneath them and the water level around. Maria rose slightly. The natural dam was unstable and their time was limited. What are we going to do? Maria asked, fighting to keep the fear from her voice. No one knows where we are. James looked up at the sky, then back at Maria. His expression was determined, with a calm certainty that somehow eased her fear. Ray made it to safety. He'll get help, and our families will be looking for us by now. He squeezed her hand. We just need to hold on until they find us. And if this dam breaks before then? It won't, James said with more confidence than he felt. But just in case, I'm going to try to brace it. He looked around, assessing the debris surrounding them. There are some bigger branches here. If I can wedge them properly, it might help stabilize this whole pile. Before Maria could respond, a sound cut through the constant rush of water, a distant wailing that could only be emergency sirens. They looked at each other, hope dawning on both their faces. They're coming, Maria whispered. They're really coming. James squeezed her hand again. Told you. Now we just need to make sure they can find us. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted as loudly as he could. Help, we're down here, help! Maria joined in, ignoring the pain in her chest as she called out. Their voices echoed off the hillsides but were quickly swallowed by the storm's lingering winds and the rush of the swollen creek. They'll never hear us, she said after a minute, her throat raw from shouting. James refused to give up. Looking around again, he spotted something white caught in the branches near them, a piece of Maria's wedding veil. With careful movements, he worked his way over to it and pulled it free. We need to make this more visible, he said, holding up the mud-stained but still recognizable white fabric. Understanding immediately, Maria pulled off James's suit jacket, which she was still wearing. Use this too. The dark color will contrast with the veil. Working quickly, James tied the veil and jacket together, then secured them to the longest branch he could find. With a final effort that sent pain shooting through his battered body, he raised this makeshift flag as high as he could, wedging the branch securely among the debris. The white and dark fabric fluttered in the wind, a stark contrast to the browns and greens of the natural surroundings. It wasn't much, but it was something that might catch the eye of searchers. "Now we wait," James said, making his way back to Maria's side. He positioned himself next to her, half sitting in the muddy water, and carefully lifted her head to rest on his lap, protecting her from the worst of the cold water. "I'm sorry about your dress," he said softly, looking down at the once beautiful gown now torn and stained beyond recognition. Maria managed a weak laugh. "I'm sorry about your car. Your best man is going to kill you. Pretty sure he'll forgive me under the circumstances." James gently brushed a strand of mud-caked hair from her face. "Besides, you're all that matters. Everything else can be replaced." They fell silent then, conserving their energy, listening to the distant sirens that seemed neither to draw closer nor fade away. The pain in Maria's legs had turned to a dull ache, and the cold had numbed much of her body. She found herself fighting to stay awake, knowing instinctively that falling asleep would be dangerous. "Talk to me," she murmured to James. "Keep me awake. What should I talk about?" "Anything. Tell me about our honeymoon. Tell me what we're going to do when we get there." James smiled, playing along. "Well, first of all, we're going to take the longest, hottest shower in history. Together, of course." He felt her small laugh against his leg. "Then we're going to wrap up in those fluffy robes from the hotel and order room service. Everything on the menu." "Everything?" Maria asked, her voice faint but amused. "Absolutely everything, and we're not leaving that room for at least 2 days." As James continued to paint this comforting picture of their future, describing in detail the cottage they had rented and all the things they would do there, he kept one eye on their surroundings. The water level was rising steadily, and the debris beneath them shifted occasionally with ominous creaks and groans. He knew their situation was precarious at best, but refused to let Maria see his fear. Instead, he kept talking, his voice a lifeline for both of them, as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. He talked about the home they would build together, the holidays they would share, the children they hoped to have someday. He talked as if their future was certain, as if this was just a brief, unpleasant interruption in a long and happy life. Together. And all the while, the makeshift flag fluttered above them, a desperate signal to a world that might never see it in time. The search and rescue operation began in earnest as soon as the worst of the storm passed. 3 separate teams were deployed, one starting from the chapel where the wedding had taken place, one from the reception venue where anxious family members waited for news, and one from the location where Ray had made his emergency call. Ray had refused to leave the area, despite the continued danger from the unstable hillside. "I can show them exactly where it happened," he insisted when the first rescue team arrived, their bright yellow jackets stark against the gray backdrop of the storm-ravaged landscape. "I saw where they went down." The rescue team leader, a woman, named Diane with 20 years of experience in mountain rescue, listened carefully to Ray's account. Her weathered face remained professionally neutral, but inwardly she felt a pang of despair. In her experience, the chances of survival in a landslide of the magnitude Ray described were slim to none. Still, she had witnessed enough miracles in her career to know that giving up was never an option. "We'll find them," she assured Ray, though she made no promises about what condition they might be in when found. "Our team is the best." They began the search methodically, working their way down from the point where Ray had last seen the couple. The going was treacherous, the ground still unstable, the mud deep and slippery. Every few minutes, team members would stop to call out, listening intently for any response before moving on. Meanwhile, at the reception venue, the atmosphere had shifted from worried to frantic. News of the landslide had reached the wedding guests, and the reality of the situation was sinking in. Linda, Maria's mother, had nearly collapsed when she heard the report, and was now being attended to by a paramedic who had been called to the scene. "My baby girl," she kept whispering, her face pale with shock. "My baby girl, and her new husband." James's parents stood nearby, his father still on the phone with emergency services, demanding updates, while his mother clutched a handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the television where the local news was covering the storm damage. The reporter's voice droned on, listing road closures and evacuations, each word a reminder of the dangers their children might be facing. The best man paced near the window, watching the rain, which had finally begun to slacken. "I should have gone with them," he said to no one in particular. "I should have driven them myself." One of the bridesmaids, still in her pale blue gown, put a comforting hand on his arm. "This isn't your fault. No one could have predicted this storm." But guilt was a common emotion in the room, spreading from person to person like a contagion. The wedding planner blamed himself for not checking the weather more carefully. The maid of honor blamed herself for not insisting that Maria change before leaving the chapel. Maria's father blamed himself for not being more insistent about the couple taking the limousine directly to the reception. In truth, no one was to blame except the unpredictable forces of nature that had conspired to turn a perfect day into a nightmare. But humans, in their need to make sense of tragedy, often look first for fault. Back at the creek, James had lost track of time. His legs had gone numb from sitting in the cold water, and his voice was hoarse from calling for help and talking to Maria. She had grown quieter over the past hour, responding less and less to his questions and stories. He knew this was a bad sign, that the cold and shock were taking their toll on her system. "Stay with me, Maria," he urged, gently shaking her shoulder when her eyes drifted closed. "Just a little longer. Help is coming." She blinked up at him, her once vibrant eyes now dull with pain and exhaustion. "I'm so tired, James." "I know, honey. I know. But you can't sleep yet." He cast about desperately for something to keep her engaged. "Tell me about the house we're going to build. What color do you want for the kitchen?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Yellow, sunny yellow." "Yellow it is." "And the living room?" "Something warm. Maybe a soft green." "Perfect. We'll have a fireplace. Too, right, for those cold winter nights?" Maria nodded slightly, "with a big comfy couch where we can curl up together." "Absolutely, the comfiest couch ever made. We'll have to test 100 of them to find the right one." This small exchange seemed to revive her somewhat, and James felt a surge of hope. They just needed to hold on a little longer. Surely help would find them soon. As if in answer to his thoughts, he heard something, a sound different from the constant rush of water and the occasional creaking of the debris pile. He froze, listening intently. There it was again, a faint shout almost lost in the ambient noise of the storm's aftermath. "Hello," he yelled, his voice cracking with the effort. "We're here, help!" Maria stirred at his sudden movement. "What is it?" "I heard something. I think—" He stopped, listening again. Yes, there were definitely voices, and they were getting closer. "I think they're coming. They're finally coming." With renewed energy, he shouted again, waving his arms despite the pain that shot through his battered body with each movement. Their makeshift flag still fluttered above them, but he feared it wasn't visible enough from a distance. Then, like an answer to a prayer, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the creek bed. The storm was finally passing, the skies beginning to clear, and in that sudden brightness their flag stood out starkly against the muddy debris. "There," a voice called from somewhere up the hillside. "I see something." James's heart leapt. "Here," he shouted back. "We're down here." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Rescuers in bright jackets appeared at the edge of the creek, quickly assessing the situation. One called into a radio, reporting that they had found survivors. Yes, 2, both conscious, 1 trapped. They needed extraction equipment and medical support immediately. 2 rescuers carefully made their way down to the debris pile, testing each step to ensure it was stable before committing their weight to it. When they reached James and Maria, their professional demeanor couldn't quite hide their surprise at finding the couple still in their wedding attire. "Well, this is a first," one commented as he checked Maria's vital signs. "Rescuing a bride and groom on their wedding day. Special occasion rescue," the other agreed, her hands gentle as she placed a thermal blanket around James's shoulders. Let's make sure you both get to enjoy that honeymoon. The extraction was a delicate process. The tree pinning Maria couldn't simply be lifted. The entire debris dam was unstable, and any wrong move could send everything, including the trapped couple, rushing downstream. The rescue team worked methodically, securing lines to stable points, reinforcing the dam where possible, and carefully calculating the best approach. More rescuers arrived, bringing specialized equipment. A paramedic made his way to Maria's side, administering pain medication and fluids through an IV. Another checked James over, concerned about his prolonged exposure to the cold water and the numerous cuts and bruises covering his body. "You're both suffering from hypothermia," the paramedic explained as he worked. "But your vital signs are stronger than I would have expected given the circumstances. You're fighters, both of you." "It's our wedding day," James said simply, as if that explained everything, and in a way it did. The promise they had made to each other just hours earlier, to stay together through better or worse, had given them the strength to hold on when many others might have given up. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, but was actually just over an hour, they were ready to attempt the extraction. Using hydraulic equipment, the rescue team carefully lifted the tree trunk just enough to slide Maria free. The moment her legs were released, she cried out in pain, the return of circulation bringing with it a new kind of agony. "It's normal," the paramedic assured her as she was secured to a backboard. "Your legs were compressed for a long time. We'll get you to the hospital soon." James refused to be evacuated separately. Despite his own injuries and exhaustion, he insisted on walking alongside Maria's stretcher as it was carefully carried up the hillside. Only when they reached the waiting ambulance did he finally allow himself to be treated as a patient, rather than a protective husband. As they were loaded into the ambulance, a familiar face appeared. Ray, his clothes still mud-stained, his expression a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. "You made it," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I saw you both go down. I thought for sure." "Thank you," James said simply, reaching out to clasp the man's hand. "For getting help. For not giving up on us." Ray nodded, unable to speak further. He stepped back as the ambulance doors closed, watching as the vehicle carefully navigated the damaged road, carrying its precious cargo to safety. The news of their rescue spread quickly. At the reception venue, the mood transformed in an instant from despair to jubilation. Linda collapsed into her husband's arms, this time from relief rather than grief. James's parents hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. The best man let out a whoop of joy that startled everyone, then apologized, grinning through his own tears. Plans were immediately made to go to the hospital. The wedding guests, who had refused to leave despite the passing hours, now rallied to help with practical matters. Some volunteered to clean up the reception venue. Others offered to drive family members to the hospital. A few began organizing a schedule to ensure that James and Maria would have support during their recovery. In the midst of the chaos, the wedding coordinator found himself standing next to the untouched wedding cake, a beautiful three-tiered creation that had been carefully transported to the venue before the storm hit. For hours, it had stood as a poignant reminder of the celebration that should have been taking place. Now, looking at it, he had an idea. At the hospital, James and Maria were taken to separate treatment rooms despite their protests. Doctors needed to assess their conditions thoroughly. Maria's legs required x-rays to check for fractures, and both needed treatment for hypothermia and numerous cuts and bruises. James was the first to be cleared, though the doctors insisted he remain for observation overnight. The moment he was allowed, he made his way to Maria's room, moving slowly due to his own injuries, but determined to be by her side. He found her propped up in bed, her legs bandaged, but miraculously not broken. The doctors had explained that the soft mud had likely cushioned the impact of the tree, preventing more serious damage. She would be bruised and sore for weeks, and there was some concern about possible nerve damage, but the prognosis was generally positive. "Hey, beautiful," James said as he entered the room, his heart swelling at the sight of her. Even with her hair matted with mud, her face pale and dark circles under her eyes, She was the most wonderful sight he had ever seen. Maria's face lit up when she saw him. "You look terrible," she teased, though her eyes were soft with love. "You should talk," he shot back, carefully sitting on the edge of her bed and taking her hand. "But the doctors say we'll both make a full recovery." "Just in time for our rescheduled honeymoon?" "Absolutely, though I think we've had enough adventure to last us a while." He leaned forward to kiss her gently. "Maybe we skip the scenic drives next time." Their quiet moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. To their surprise, it opened to reveal not just their immediate families, but what seemed like half their wedding party, all crowding into the hallway outside. And at the front, held carefully by the wedding coordinator, was their wedding cake. "We thought," he explained with a smile, "that since you missed the reception, we'd bring a bit of the reception to you." As their loved ones filed in, filling the small hospital room with warmth and joy and relieved laughter, Maria looked up at James. In his eyes she saw the same thought that was going through her own mind. This wasn't how they had planned to spend their wedding day, but in some ways, it was even more meaningful than the perfect celebration they had imagined. They had faced death together and survived. They had kept each other going through the darkest hours. And now, surrounded by the people who loved them most in the world, they were beginning their marriage with a profound understanding of what those vows really meant. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, they had already lived those promises in the most intense way possible. And as James carefully fed Maria the first bite of their wedding cake, both of them still bandaged and exhausted but undeniably alive, they knew one thing for certain. Whatever challenges life might bring them in the years ahead, they would face them together, just as they had faced the storm. The reason that shocked everyone wasn't just the unexpected fury of the storm or the tragic timing of the landslide. It was the extraordinary strength of two ordinary people who refused to let go of each other, even when the world was quite literally crumbling beneath their feet. It was a testament to the power of love, not just romantic love, but the love of family and community that had driven rescuers to search tirelessly and strangers like Ray to risk their own safety to help. In the years that followed, James and Maria would often be asked about that day. People were curious, sometimes morbidly so, about what it was like to nearly die on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Their answer was always the same. It was the happiest day of their lives, not despite the tragedy, but because of what it taught them, that they were stronger together than they ever could be apart, and that every moment they had together was a precious gift not to be taken for granted. And whenever anyone expressed sympathy for their ruined wedding day, they would just smile at each other, sharing a private understanding that no one else could truly comprehend. Their wedding might not have gone according to plan, but their marriage had been forged in circumstances that tested the very essence of their vows, and they had passed that test with flying colors.